Welcome back. It is time for part two of tonight's The World This Week. We've been looking at the headlines of the week. We've had a look at what's been happening in Greece and what's coming out of Athens tonight. Also, the French government's survival of the no-confidence vote in the Parliament this week on the back of its forcing through of the Macron reforms to the French economy. I'm joined here in the studio by Catherine Field, who's an independent journalist based here in Paris, Sylvie Kaufmann, who's the editorial director of Le Monde and a columnist who contributes to the New York Times, joins us as well, and Elisabeth Moutet, a columnist at the British Sunday Telegraph, and Bernard Guetta, who's a commentator on foreign relations at France Inter and a columnist at Libération. We're going to move on now to events in Ukraine. We've seen these pictures tonight from the Maidan. Thousands of people turned out to remember the Heavenly 100, those who were killed in the clashes that led to the fall of Viktor Yanukovych a year ago. Of course, even as they gathered, the fighting in eastern Ukraine has spread beyond the town of Debaltseve that fell earlier this week to the separatists and on to other towns along the front line. Kiev has accused Russia of sending in more tanks, and all eyes are now heading southwards towards Mariupol. Everyone had thought, and Elisabeth Moutet, that with the fall of Debaltseve, perhaps the thirst for territory of the separatists and behind them of Moscow might be quenched, and Minsk too implemented even along this redrawn ceasefire line. That seems not to have proved to be the case.
I don't think everyone believed it. I think the Russians are out to get everything they can possibly get. I don't think they were sincere in anything. I think it's the old Putin. Putin is basically sort of channeling his Soviet inner spirit, and everything that's mine is mine, and everything that's yours is negotiable. The Russian press, the Russian press, television are full of stories about how there are really fascists and Nazis in power, in parliament, committing atrocities to an extent that is almost unbelievable. It's a bit like those stories of nun killing German soldiers in 1915. It is that level of propaganda. This is a country that's poised to recover as much of Ukraine as they possibly can.
Bernard Guetta, it seems that those who feared that the weakness of the West would only feed the provocations of Moscow seems to have been proven right. It was spectacular today to see François Hollande and Angela Merkel talk about the need for patience and the hope that Minsk might yet be agreed, even as the fighting continued.
But is it a weakness or a right assessment of the balance of power? In any case, Russia in Ukraine is much stronger than the European Union and even the USA are. And Russia, with its army and the full power of its army, has a common and quite long border with Ukraine. Well, Poland also has, and Poland is a member of the European Union. But this is not at all the same situation. First, European Union hasn't any armed forces, and second, America is far away, without any common border. And so, this is the first imbalance of the balance of power. And second, Mr. Putin is perfectly ready to engage into a war in Ukraine. European Union said a year ago, obviously, we will not fight a war in Ukraine. And as soon as you say, obviously, we will not fight, you are losing the war. Obviously. And so I would say that the war is lost in any case. And taking it into account this situation, striking a compromise is very, very difficult. And so the task for Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande was very tough in Minsk. And I would say, sadly, very sadly, that they did quite well taking into account the balance of power.
And that balance of power couldn't have been more clearly exposed today, even as François Hollande and Angela Merkel were talking about the need to implement Minsk II on the ground in eastern Ukraine. There was Vladimir Putin telling an address for a national holiday that's been to be held next week. Russia is simply the strongest militarily. No one can take us on. That is the fact of the balance of power.
Well, one of the problems we've got here at the moment, which we didn't have in the Cold War, is that it's just unpredictable. During the Cold War, everyone sort of vaguely knew what each side was going to do. People sort of figured that the Soviets were going to do this, the West were going to do that. At the moment, there isn't that predictability. There aren't the channels of communication open. Hillary Clinton, she tried the reset with the Russian foreign minister. That hasn't worked. So we are looking at a very different situation, and I know people are saying this is back to the Cold War. I would say that perhaps because of the lack of communication between each side, we're going back perhaps a period of like 1983, 1982, when we almost accidentally stumbled into war, when there was the NATO, what was it called, Archer incident, where there was a NATO exercise, Able Archer, and the Soviets misread it and thought they were being invaded. And I think that's the problem. There's no communication on any level, and there's just complete unpredictability.
Unpredictability, Sylvie Kaufmann, and on the ground, separatists who seem absolutely unstoppable.
Yes, I mean, I think there is unpredictability, you're right, but also I think most of the Western leaders have misread Vladimir Putin's ambitions and intentions, and it's interesting to see, you're right, Angela Merkel and François Hollande still insisting on the on Minsk II agreement, and thinking apparently there's still a chance that it can be enforced when we have I was going to say the Russian forces. I mean, we all know there are Russian forces there, even though Putin and Lavrov keep denying it, you know, when everybody can see on the ground. But, you know, those rebel forces supported by Russian troops and equipment and intelligence and whatever are still forcing their way through Ukraine and gaining territory after these negotiations. So it's quite mind-boggling why European leaders keep advocating patience and diplomacy. I mean, Bernard is right. They said they wouldn't go to war over this. You know, like Barack Obama said there would be a red line with chemical weapons in Syria, and when chemical weapons were found, well, he said, no, we're still
the red line could not be found.
Yeah, and yet now he's going to war. And we are all involved in a war in the Middle East. I mean, it's an air war, but you know, so it's a very complex situation, and I'm not sure in a couple of months' time we'll still be talking about diplomacy and negotiation.
One of the reasons, of course, they're still talking about patience and diplomacy is that, in a sense, that's all they have, the Europeans.
I'm not so sure. You have Russia's economy basically crumbling down. For reasons of their own, the Saudis decided that shale oil was really dangerous in America, and therefore the price of oil has gone down threefold. Russia, it's very expensive to drill for oil in Russia, so the income of about half their mineral resources is not available to them. The sanctions, which they took very badly because they're very nationalistic, all the same had an effect. There was no firmness and there was no unity, but I don't think we were absolutely weaponless. All their money is, I mean, a great deal of their money is actually in the West because there is rule of law in the West, and we offer that. We offer shelter in a place where the government can confiscate what you have. I don't think we were weak in front of Russia, except that we decided that we were. And I think first of all, it was absolutely impossible with the satellites, with everything. It was not very difficult to know what the Russians wanted because, quite frankly, they were saying it in Russian on RTTV. It was very easy to know what they wanted. And so I think and Eastern Europeans of the EU, people like the Latvians and the Estonians, they knew it perfectly well, and they were tweeting about it, and politicians were tweeting about it, and they are afraid that they're going to be next. So I think there is really, we were told that creating Europe, the founding fathers of Europe were going to start war on the continent, and they were going to create something that was increasingly more towards a European government, precisely to avoid that kind of situation. What do we have? Nothing.
You know, I'm not at all optimistic about this situation, but I would try to give two reasons to be nevertheless not too pessimistic. First, as you said, we are not weaponless. Economy is a weapon against Mr. Putin. And second, and much more important, after all, Mr. Putin already won this war. He got back Crimea. He got a French and a German and probably an Italian, Spanish, and so on veto to a new enlargement of NATO, including Ukraine in the Atlantic Alliance. Third, he can claim that he saved from a genocide the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and so he can tell his own people, the Russian people, well, you see, I was tough and I won.
Yeah,
But just a minute.
He was a Western leader.
On the other side, by pursuing the war, he would lose week after week and months after months, because the economic sanction will get much tougher, and the division of the Russian opinion, which does exist.
Yeah, right now he's got 70% behind him.
Right now?
Yep.
But not in 3 months, not in 6 months.
You think the effect of the sanctions will make
of course,
have its impact
there is a
politically?
public opinion in Russia. Certainly, yes.
But Putin said it would take 2 years.
I think we should also start using this other
Maybe not
weapon.
6 months, 2 years, I don't know.
It was breakfast, he now wants lunch.
Yeah, and I think we should start using the weapon of propaganda again. We're not really playing the same game. There are photos, there are satellite photos of those troops, of Russian troops. Everybody talks about the money that Vladimir Putin has got in bank accounts in the West. Let's publish those. If the Russian people have got access to more information, then let's give them more information.
You're absolutely right, but don't forget that America itself, not so much Europe, America badly needs Russian support in the Middle East.
And it will therefore refrain from arming Ukrainian troops, whatever happened. This had been the next thread.
That's support? I mean, the Russians are providing support in the Middle East. The Russians are playing their own game. The Russians are never, it's not support, they happen sometimes to coincide with immediate sort of prevention of complete catastrophe, but that is not support. I think we're weak, and I think he sees they're weak, and he thinks it's wonderful, keep at it. And the other thing is, I think we all underestimate, first of all, his public opinion is very different from our public opinion. It's really a different way of thinking. I don't think
Not at all, they are human beings,
They are human beings, but the techniques of communications are entirely different. And basically, they like what he does now. And if he says we are being, when the sanctions were not very important, when the sanctions happened against Russia, there was this whole thing is this is a great patriotic war starting again. It is an entirely different way of thinking, and he's playing it very well because he's very competent.
Yeah.
And we know
This is
nothing
an
about
important
it.
point. We're not fighting the same battle.
Yeah,
We're not
exactly.
fighting the
I
same
don't
ground.
think we are. It's not a question of being weak or strong. I think we are not playing the same game. And of course, Vladimir Putin has imposed a military situation, and we are not ready to play on these terms. But as you said, we have other weapons. And one other positive thing is that, despite what is being said, I think that the West has been fairly united on this issue.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was not the case at the beginning. It was difficult. We obviously have differences because, as Bernard said, this is Europe, and European countries whose Russia is their neighbor, and so they are bound to have different interests and different sensitivities and different reactions and different views. America is far away, their businesses are less involved, and so on. But yet we have been able to keep together, I think, and to even within Europe. I mean, look at where we're coming from. Those differences on the sanctions, Hungary, Greece, and yet we are all voted. We had unanimity on these sanctions.
So the Greece and Baltic countries.
Exactly. So I think, it's not that bad, but it is difficult. It is definitely difficult.
But I think the other point that we're forgetting is Ukraine. At the moment, Ukraine is very weak. Poroshenko has not really made the country any stronger.
Well, nor could he under the circumstances.
Well, he hasn't done anything about corruption, he hasn't done anything about rule of law, and this situation is not going to improve while ever Ukraine is this weak. The population is still angry about the same issues it went out onto the streets for a year ago, which was corruption.
And indeed,
it's all still there.
Our correspondent on the Maidan tonight was saying that Petro Poroshenko had been booed by a substantial proportion of the crowd this evening. So
and
we're
that
backing up what
really
you're
does
saying.
play into Vladimir Putin's hands.
I'd like to take us back before we run out of time to a story here in France. It began on the metro on the day when Chelsea fans were in Paris for a football match, after which they got on the tube. None of this would have been public but for the fact that this video was shot by a journalist who happened to be standing around and pulled out his phone and then put this on social media networks. The man himself went home, spoke, having been pushed off the train and had racist insults thrown at him, went home, didn't speak about it to his wife or child. Why should I have, he said, once he'd been located. Now he says he's going to try and pursue charges against the men. It was almost, one sensed, looking at how he'd reacted initially, Bernard Guetta, something he was used to or didn't think was terribly important. And once he'd seen the fuss, and it did become a substantial fuss, David Cameron intervened about it, realized that it was far more shocking than I think even he'd imagined.
It was shocking, extremely shocking. But I will shock maybe 3 of my friends. But after all, it wasn't a French story, but a British one.
Yeah. These were British football fans.
Those people were not French.
Although if he was used to this, it means that probably it had happened to him before in France with French people.
Yes, but certainly yes, but quite differently. Frankly speaking, I don't imagine a crowd of French supporters of any football club in France publicly and so atrociously shooting racist sentences and words on the subway. Maybe I'm naive. But I don't even. I said publicly and so atrociously.
Well, I would ask you to have a look at a report that came up this week by the Council of Europe that did specifically say there is a tendency of racism in France. You don't have to travel very far to see this racism in France.
But why in France? In all the countries.
Well, we're talking about France.
We're talking about France.
But in this case, English football
but
supporters.
Why specifically
in this case, yes.
It is English football
I think
supporters.
the guy himself said that he was, as you said, he didn't react at the beginning because this is a situation. He's not exactly that situation, but it's a situation.
Did you see this YouTube footage of this journalist wearing a skull cap as if he were Jewish and being filmed by a hidden camera for 10 hours? And how he was hit and insulted.
I would discuss that. I would discuss the movie.
Who filmed that?
In central Paris.
No, it's not in central Paris.
It also in central Paris. There were bits in central Paris.
And
anyway, is it it's all right if it happens in the suburbs. We are civilized in central Paris, and you can hit Jews outside central Paris.
No.
I have a problem with this.
It's not a question of saying that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in France. It does exist, unfortunately, we're witnessing it fairly dramatically at the moment, but this particular video, I think, was not very honest.
Bernard, you agree with that?
I would say so.
How?
Well, I think it was not exactly true. The location were not clear. And I think the location was specifically chosen, it was in an Arab neighborhood. And also, I understand this was put out by a news group which is fairly close to the Prime Minister of Israel, right?
I have no idea.
So there was a video
you're right.
done
You're right.
with a political agenda.
It's not.
And I would take the opportunity to say that
it's not a foreign country. It's France.
It also goes in this campaign, within this campaign of waged by Prime Minister Netanyahu to tell the French Jews to leave for Israel. And I think French Jewish organizations have been fairly clear about their views on this. They disapprove it. They think it's a very bad idea.
Question.
Well, it's part of the campaign.
The content, as far as you were concerned, and
I'm concerned about the consent and the consent. I don't think the consent was fabricated. And if you say this is an Arab neighborhood, I mean, these are people who were born in France and are French citizens and they have French passports.
I agree.
So I think it's a French issue. I personally think the Prime Minister of Israel is wrong to ask for Jews to leave France. But, and I'm completely on the side of Prime Minister Manuel Valls, which is not something you're going to hear me say every day. But he was quite right in saying that France without her Jews is not the same country. But at the same time, even if this goes, it abonds in that direction, I still have a real problem with this thing happening in my country.
And what is interesting about both
right.
videos is the extent to which, through social media and the publicising of these things, we're coming to look again at the attitudes within our own countries, within our metro networks, on our streets, of things that happen to Jews, to black people on a regular basis.
Exactly. And when you get Chelsea football fans outside among the public, it does tend to happen. And this is the awful thing, that the police knew there were 200 known hooligans among the 2,000 Chelsea supporters who came here. These people coming here, what happened to this so-called tough action against British or English football hooligans?
It seems to have been forgotten. We're going to have a look now, thanks to Emma James, who's going to join us now for a look at Media Watch, at precisely what sort of reaction those sorts of videos have been having on the internet over the last few days. Welcome back. Emma James is with us, and we're going to be starting with that metro incident that's put football fans back in the spotlight, Emma, for all the wrong reasons.
Absolutely. Le Parisien features the British front pages and seems very pleased that even The Sun, it says, which it accuses of regularly French bashing, are carrying headlines like "Find, jail and sack them all," "Jail racist thugs," and they talk about the fact that everyone is really joining in to try to identify these people, the police and the media working together. Now, if we take a look at Metro, which is a London newspaper, they say that 2 more of the Chelsea fans have been identified. The gentleman circled there is Jordan Monday, who's 20. The other man identified in this video is Jamie Fairbairn, who's 23. Now, the Metro has spoken to Monday's neighbours, who say he is going to be in a whole world of trouble with his parents, who they say, I quote, will go ballistic over this. Fairbairn's employers have said that he will face a disciplinary investigation. So it really does look as though justice of some kind is going to be meted out if these gentlemen do turn out to be the ones guilty of those racist chants and pushing this man from the train. Now, The Independent carries the story that Jose Mourinho has invited Suleiman to come to the next leg of that match, the second leg, the return leg at Stamford Bridge.
I can't imagine why he'd want to, under the circumstances.
It would be perhaps a strange choice, but Jose Mourinho says he is ashamed of what's happened and that these fans don't stand for Chelsea FC at all. 3 fans have already been suspended from attending Stamford Bridge, and following an investigation, that could become a lifetime ban. So that's how the football club is handling it, and certainly everyone seems to be quite impressed that Chelsea's taken this stance. It was criticised a great deal when John Terry, one of its players, made a racist remark, and Chelsea didn't really issue much of a sanction in that case. Now, before this announcement from Jose Mourinho, one of the Chelsea football fans actually started a campaign to raise money to get Suleiman and his family to the match at Chelsea so that they could show him really what Chelsea FC was all about. Obviously, that probably won't be necessary now. But earlier this week, Souleymane spoke to Le Parisien, and in light of what you guys were saying about racism in France, he had this to say about just how racist it is here on a daily basis.
J'étais visé à cause de la couleur de ma peau, mais après, vous savez, en France, les Noirs ont été toujours visés par la couleur de leur peau, quelle que soit leur origine.
And Franz Fagat has spoken to Souleymane today. We're just waiting for the tape to come through the doors. So later on this evening, we'll be hearing more from him.
No, we look forward to it. As we've been mentioning over the course of the evening with our guest, Emma, this isn't the first video that's highlighted people's prejudices and sort of gone viral as a result.
Absolutely. And it would seem that discrimination really is the flavour of the moment. We've got a video today that's been released of a Muslim, an Egyptian student who dressed as a Muslim imam and walked the streets of Milan for 5 hours. And the video shows that he received various racist comments. He was called a Taliban curse word, I won't say what they said. He was called ISIS. Somebody else was overheard muttering, is that a gun under his tunic? And of course this comes in the wake of Haaretz also did the same thing, a journalist from there, Zvika Klein, who went round Paris for 10 hours wearing a kippah or skull cap. He was spat at and insulted, and as you were saying, within central Paris itself there was far less of a problem, but in the suburbs he said there was a much greater degree of anti-Semitic feeling.
We're going to move on to discrimination of a different kind, Emma. A US charity which is looking to change people's opinions of the homeless.